Let me now introduce our first speaker, Edward G.Lengel. He's an American military historian and professor at the University of Virginia. Lengel is the editor-in-chief of the Papers of George Washington, the documentary editing project in Charlottesville, Virginia, and is the author of General George Washington, A Military Life, which was a finalist for the 2006 Washington Book Prize. He's also the author of Inventing George Washington, America's Founder in Myth and Memory. He has a second sidelight, second specialty, which happens to be the First World War. And he's the author of To Conquer Hell, The Meuse Argonne, 1918, and he's currently researching a prequel. But he's here this morning to address us about his first love and the father of our country, the indispensable man, George Washington. Professor Lengel.
Good morning. I first need to thank Paul Herbert of the First Division Foundation and Walter McDougall and all the folks of this museum and the Foreign Policy Research Institute. It is truly an honor and a pleasure to be here. And I'm probably the only person you'll meet who's both a specialist on George Washington and the First World War. It's a measure in some ways of insanity, I suppose, but there are ways that I can actually find to bring those together, as you'll see in a moment. George Washington is usually identified as first president of the United States, or as a planter, or as a businessman, even more so now, or more negatively as a slaveholder. When you see references to him in textbooks or in speeches, or even at Mount Vernon, where I often go to work with teachers at institutes similar to this one, usually the focus is on Washington in a political role or in a civilian role. But I believe that fundamentally Washington was a soldier, and that he viewed himself that way. In youth, he was a soldier because he aspired to be one. And in later years, because that was where he knew that he could best serve his country. And I'd like to focus in more on that and on elements of Washington's character and what made him such a remarkable soldier in this talk. Washington's views on duty were rooted in his value system, and also in his military service. Of course, he lacked formal training, but he studied military science and military history very extensively. As Americans have historically done, however, most of what Washington knew about the military and the military life, he learned on the job. He is very much in that way the quintessential American soldier who learned on the job. In particular, during the French and Indian War, when he fought on the battlefield, and he crafted, as I'll talk about in a moment, the first true regular military force in American history, the Virginia Regiment. Now, there are a couple of attitudes toward Washington and toward history that annoy me a little bit. And as teachers, you've heard these quotes probably a lot before. One of the things that always irritates me is when people say, "Hey, make history fun." That's a great teacher. He makes or she makes history fun. Well, I think history is already fun. I don't think you need to make it that way. But the other thing that people will often say about Washington is that they make Washington come alive. Now, if you go back really as early as the early 1800s, when people write about Washington or when people speak about Washington, the first thing that they lay claim to and attempt to do is say, "I'm going to make Washington come alive." And it's interesting that that has been perceived as a primary challenge in talking about Washington for really over 200 years. You can go right back to the earliest books about Washington, and they'll say, for the first time, I'm going to make Washington real, three-dimensional, a living, breathing human being. And that's some measure, I think, of the challenge in assessing Washington's character. That's partly his own fault of the attitude he took and the persona that he adopted, but it's also a sense of our craving to try to achieve some type of personal connection with Washington. we as Americans have a real need to get in touch with Washington's humanity, to understand him as a human being. But it's frustrating that generation after generation we still feel he hasn't come alive yet, and we need to make him come alive. So does that mean we've failed every single time? Everybody who's said, I'm going to make Washington come alive, they failed, because then the next guy says, well, I need to make him come alive because he isn't alive yet. So, well, I'm going to try to make him come alive for you today, and the next person you hear speak about Washington will say the same thing. Now, I think the reason why that's been such a challenge for Washington is perhaps the biggest mistake that people make in talking about him. As for many other famous individuals, this is true for Lincoln, for Jefferson, and many others, is that they view them as frozen at a certain moment in time. They will see Washington at a certain moment in his life or in a certain identity. Again, as I mentioned earlier, as a president, as a planter, as a businessman, as a soldier. Or they'll see him as a young man, as a middle-aged man, as an older man, at certain moments of his life, and they'll say, that's George Washington. Now, the truth is, of course, like all the rest of us, Washington was changing constantly throughout his life. He was in a process of growing and becoming somebody different. And for Washington in particular, that's particularly very important. When we try to get a sense or to produce a sense of why Washington is important and what his example means for young people and for us as Americans, it's very important to realize that he was on a journey to greatness. That's one of the most important things about him, is that he grew, he changed, he became better over time. And I say that when I work with students too. I say that's the example for you, is that you can start in the same place that Washington did, with many of the disadvantages that he had, with the character flaws that he had early on in his life, that he realized what they were, and he worked on them, and he improved himself, and he took a journey to greatness. He wasn't born great. Nathaniel Hawthorne, the author, he pondered the possibility in the mid-1800s of writing a novel that would have Washington as one of the major characters, and he started it and he gave up in disgust. And he quipped that he wondered if Washington was ever naked in his life, or whether even when he was born he was wearing a uniform and he took a stately bow on his first appearance in the world. That's Hawthorne's attitude, and that's much of the challenge with Washington. In my view, he was. In my view, he did change and become better. Now, if you look at Washington in particular as a soldier, that really shows how Washington changed. Washington's attitude as a soldier and in his military career and toward the military life changed greatly over time. Now, Washington lost his father when he was only 11 years old, and that removed a major formative influence from his life. His mother had to take over, Mary Ball Washington, to manage him personally, to train him, to run the estate, all the ideas of his going off to England for formal education, formal training, in whatever career he might decide to undertake. They were lost when his father died. And his mother had to kind of take charge and give him a very practical, on-the-job education in how to run an estate and how to be a planter, how to be a farmer. That was how Washington learned. And it's something that he felt insecure about and bitter about for the rest of his life. But that type of management could command his respect, but not his affection. And between Washington and his mother, there was a very uneasy relationship through most of their life, which I can talk about more if any of you'd like to know. But in his father's absence, George Washington's mentor was his older half-brother, Lawrence Washington. Now, Lawrence Washington was kind of an interesting fellow. He's a guy you'd want to have a beer with, but he was also a ne'er-do-well. He liked to talk about himself. He liked to tell stories. He liked to make things up. He liked being the center of attention. And he fed George Washington on romanticized stories of warfare and what war was like. Lawrence had served briefly in an American formation in what was called the War of Jenkins' Ear. In 1743, he sat on a British ship off Cartagena and Colombia, and the reality of that campaign was squalor, misery, disease. But when Lawrence wrote home, and when Lawrence Washington came home and talked about what he'd experienced, it was all flags waving and cannon firing and troops charging. It was a very kind of a glorified portrayal of what war was like. George inevitably heard these things. These were his first experiences and first understandings of what war was about. And George really idolized Lawrence. That influence was very important. And Lawrence kind of came up with all kinds of ridiculous schemes, one of them being he planted in George Washington's head when he was about 14 years old the idea of going off to sea and joining the British Navy. And indeed, there was a ship anchored in Alexandria that was ready to take George Washington on. George had all his bags packed, and he was ready to go out and get on this ship and go off to sea to live this romantic life as a seaman. And it wasn't until Mary Washington, George's mother, intervened, she heard about it, and she put her fist down and said no, that George had to give this up. Lawrence was also responsible for giving Washington his first observations of British troops. When Lawrence was very ill in 1751, he took George Washington on his only trip outside the continental United States, or what became the United States, to Barbados. That's the only foreign trip he ever took, on a rest cure. And I'd like to imagine that when George was there, he observed the British garrison and learned something from that. But it was finally by dying in 1752 that Lawrence opened an opportunity for George to command the militia and to take over Lawrence's post as adjutant of Virginia's northern and then southern district. And George got his first opportunities of working with militia. Now, for all of that detail, the main point I'd like to focus on is that, like many young men, Washington viewed the military life and he viewed war as a great adventure, as a proving ground, as a testing ground, for himself individually as a man, but also for his countrymen, for his fellow Americans. Washington had an opportunity in the winter of 1753, 1754 to lead a journey to the wilderness of western Pennsylvania. Now, this is not like it would be today. It's not like just, we're going to go for a hike out in the woods. This is more like getting on a helicopter and being dropped out in Somalia or something. I mean, it was a very dangerous area. It was a very frightening prospect for most people, and the idea of going out into French-controlled, Native American-controlled territory and having to give a message from the governor of Virginia to the commander of French forces in the region saying, "Get out, we don't want you here," was really a very daunting and frightening prospect, with just about a dozen men with him also having to negotiate with Native Americans. George Washington saw this opportunity and he said, "Give it to me. I'm ready to go. This will be exciting." And his attitude on this journey to the frontier, there are lots of stories I could tell about it if I had time. It was really a great adventure, and Washington looked at it as a great adventure. He looked at it as an opportunity to prove himself. He ended up being working with a frontiersman named Christopher Gist, a hardened frontiersman from Maryland, an Indian trader, and George had to accompany him through the woods, and Gist kind of looked at George and said, "Who is this young whippersnapper who thinks he can do everything?" And they wrote parallel accounts of what they accomplished. And George's account of his journey to the frontier is very, "Hey, look at all these great things that I did," and it was very exciting and bold. And Christopher Gist wrote his diary of what happened, and he's saying, "Yeah, George thought he could do everything, but he really couldn't." He ended up wearing himself out and making a fool of himself in some examples. But nevertheless, Washington showed his bravery, and despite his exhaustion, despite being tested to his physical and emotional limits, the conclusion of that expedition only whetted his appetite for more adventure. Now, Washington was appointed lieutenant colonel of the Virginia Regiment in March 1754, and that was where he really had his first opportunity to command men and try to bring them together in some type of cohesive military force. And let's be honest, it was a disaster. Washington, in his first opportunity to command men, was pretty close to being a failure. And there were many reasons for that. The social divide between Washington and his own relatively privileged background. He wasn't super wealthy by any means, but relatively privileged background, and having to work with folks from all types of different backgrounds. He couldn't quite understand them, nor could they understand him. He was rather clumsy with them in trying to enforce discipline, and he did not earn their trust or respect for his authority. Nor was his military judgment, of the best. The event that's typically understood to have touched off the French and Indian War was a battle, if you could call it that, really a skirmish at a place called Jumonville's Glen in May of 1754. To be very brief, Washington is with some Virginians and also some allied Native Americans on the frontier. There are a lot of tensions between colonial forces and the British, and also between them and with the French. And Washington hears that a French force is approaching through the woods, and that they are not approaching through the generally accepted means, in other words, along the main roads and letting you know where they are, but they're kind of sneaking through the woods. So Washington immediately jumps to the conclusion, well, they're obviously out to attack us, so we have to beat them to the punch. And Washington works with his own forces and Native Americans and ambushes them, and ends up killing several of them. The Lieutenant Jumonville is also mortally wounded, and then it's only after he's launched the attack that he finds the French were actually on their way to a parley. They just wanted to negotiate. And you can imagine how his face fell when he learned about that. And then the affair at Fort Necessity afterwards, when the French send out an expedition under Jumonville's brother to take revenge. Washington gets to this fort at Fort Necessity, which he says it's a charming field for an encounter, but it's actually very poorly sited, and he neglects to clear the woods at a far enough distance around the fort, and the French are able to come up in the woods and fire down into the fort. Washington has to surrender and sign a document confessing that he assassinated Jumonville. It's really a humiliation. Nevertheless, for all of this, several important character traits emerged in Washington even at this early time. One, his strong powers of observation. In observing what happens and observing how others work. His ability to learn from, if not always to admit, mistakes. He did have a trouble with admitting mistakes, but deep down he learned from them. His persistence and his work ethic. Now, when I look at Washington and I think about one of the things that truly made him great, is that he had true modesty, or true humility, if you want to call it that. True humility or true modesty is not, oh, I'm too humble, I can't do this, I'm not good enough. But it's the ability to look at yourself and see yourself as you are. This is something I think that you're either born with or possibly you learn. I think Washington was born with it. It was something that just came to him naturally. He looked at himself and he saw the mistakes that he made. He saw the abilities that he had. and he resolved in the areas where he fell short to do better. So despite his early mistakes, he zeroed in on those mistakes that he made, and he said, I really did not do a good job here, and I need to learn from it and improve. And you see that throughout his career. He gets better and better. In July of 1755, and the following year, now the French and Indian War was really touched off by the Jumonville affair. These qualities came to the fore as Washington learned from the mistakes of General Edward Braddock, British General Edward Braddock, who was sent to launch an expedition also to the frontier. Washington observes Braddock's mistakes in administration, military administration, and particularly in communication with civilian leaders. And he files them away for future reference. Braddock was probably not as incompetent as legend makes him out to be, but one of the things that he definitely had trouble with was working with civilians and understanding that even as a military leader, you cannot overlook the people who provide your military force with its basic means of support. You cannot afford to be high-handed or arrogant or dismissive of even the humblest of individuals, because eventually it comes back to bite you, and eventually you'll regret it. Washington saw that with Braddock, and he applied those lessons later on, as I'll get to in a moment. Washington also unquestionably, in Braddock's defeat in July of 55, showed great personal bravery on the battlefield. As an aide-de-camp and as an understudy, he carefully observed and admired, I'd underline that, admired what he saw of British military methods close at hand. But he also decried their performance under pressure. Now, this is one of the myths of American military history. And it dates from way back. I think it dates from this period. It's the myth that there was and is a specifically American way of war that completely contrasted with a British or European way of war. And that the European way of war was wholly unsuited to conditions in North America. And the fact that the British didn't know how to fight in North America supposedly was what doomed them in the long run in the Revolutionary War. And that the reason that Americans won in the long run is because they knew how to hide behind trees and they knew how to fight like Indians fight. That the British were robotic and over-disciplined. I always remember this cartoon I saw as a kid, a Bugs Bunny cartoon that recreated Bunker Hill, where the redcoats are marching up the hill shoulder to shoulder and with these kind of wide open eyes thinking, what's going to happen to us? And the cannon are at the top of the hill and they fire right into the redcoats. And like in all of these cartoons, they're blackened and blasted without actually being hurt. That was somehow the way the British fought, that they were robots, that they were over-disciplined. And indeed, that was how many Americans thought at the time. And when they looked at Braddock's defeat, when a party of French Canadians, Native Americans attacked the British in the woods, and that somehow, supposedly, the British were too disciplined to be able to react effectively, that was the myth. What Washington observed in this battle and what he learned from was that indeed the opposite was the case. The British did not build and win an empire by accident. They built an empire because they knew what they were doing, and they did it well. What Washington saw was that the British failed and Braddock failed because they were not disciplined enough, because they failed to practice effectively what they preached in terms of military tactics and execution. That when push came to shove and when they were under attack, they broke. They didn't listen to their officers. They ran. For Washington, this was an eye-opening experience. For all that the British claim to be so effective and so overwhelming, when you put them under pressure, if they lose their discipline, they become nothing but a rabble. So the story that many of you have probably heard, that during this battle, Washington sees the attack underway, and he goes up to Braddock and he says, "Let us go into the woods and fight as the Indians do. We Americans, we know how to fight like Indians." And Braddock says, "You fool, get out of my sight. You Americans don't know how to fight like we British do." That's a myth. And that was not the lesson that Washington learned. Now, Washington showed great bravery. He was the only unwounded leader on the battlefield, and he played an important role in pulling those troops, what was left of them, out and bringing them out from this disaster and bringing them home. But this was also a transformative experience in another respect. Washington learned in this battle another aspect of what war was really about. Now, he had suffered some minor defeats at Fort Necessity. That was traumatic for him. But in Braddock's defeat, and Washington wrote about it afterwards, that retreat from the battlefield during the night, the cries of the wounded and the suffering and the experience of that massive defeat stayed with him, and his attitude toward war changed. It's not a moment of disillusionment, as some would say, the old cliche of young men marching off to war full of ideals and being broken by the reality of combat and coming home disillusioned and embittered and traumatized. But Washington saw things more realistically as they really were. When he came from this battle, he had a better sense of what war entails and the challenges and the suffering that war entails. I'll get back to that in a moment. But in the aftermath of Braddock's defeat in the following years, Washington is charged with building the Virginia Regiment. There's a lot I could say about this if I had more time. But what Washington sees as his challenge, he's tasked with creating an American military force that can stand up side by side with the British and say, "We're just as good as you are." Now, if Washington's lesson that he learned from Braddock's defeat and from his experiences is, we Americans know how to fight like the Indians do, you would have expected him to form some type of irregular force, some kind of like early example of Army Rangers or something who knew how to fight light infantry style. What Washington does is he tries to build a very conventional, very well-disciplined military force on the British model, with the goal, again, of saying, we Americans can do everything that you British can do, just as well. Not that we're going to fight in a different way, but we can do just what you do. And one of the things that he learns from this experience that's so effective and that he applies later on is understanding the importance of fundamentals. I cannot emphasize this enough, because I think this was one of the greatest achievements of Washington as a captain, was understanding the importance of fundamentals. And what do I mean by fundamentals? Fundamentals is not so much in Washington's understanding of what type of tactics do you employ, what type of weapons do you use, how are you going to outmaneuver the enemy on the battlefield, things like that. Fundamentals means what matters to your soldiers. Where are they going to get their next meal from? What's the quality of their food going to be? Where are they going to get shelter? What type of clothes are they going to wear? Are they going to be warm in the winter? Are they going to be cool in the summer? Are they going to have rest? Are they going to get enough sleep? Washington learns and understands that in building the Virginia Regiment. He says the first things that I need to do is make sure that this regiment is well supplied, that it's well administered, that it's well managed, that it has superb communications and liaison, internal and external, And that as commander of the Virginia Regiment, I talked to people. Now, it's not enough as a military commander to say, my men need supplies, you go get them for my men. But you have to talk and you have to negotiate and you have to work with people to make sure that when your unit needs these supplies, when it needs these fundamentals, that they're there. So Washington talks. He talks to politicians. He talks to local officials. He talks to farmers. He talks to all the people he's going to need to make this a well-supplied and efficient and effective regiment with high morale. And again, I could say much more about this. I'll get back to these principles he learns in a moment in the Revolutionary War. But he's very successful, and in fact, the British officers who observe what he does with the Virginia Regiment all say he has actually accomplished much more than we ever imagined he'd be able to do. He has actually built a unit that can stand even roughly on par with British regular army units. And that's a huge accomplishment. Now, Washington still makes mistakes. There are still things he has to learn. In 1758, in the Forbes campaign that goes to Fort Duquesne and ends in Fort Duquesne's destruction, Washington still shows some of those flaws. He complains endlessly. He alienates superiors. He alienates some other officers by showing his emotions too much, by becoming embittered when things don't go the way he wants them to go, and being too vocal about that. But again, he sees those mistakes that he makes, and he'll learn from them later on. When Washington resigned from the Virginia Regiment, and there end up being two of them, but when he resigns to get married in 1759, his officers and men separate from him and they exchange letters with each other with real sadness. And that sets a precedent for what's going to happen later on. After the French and Indian War ended, Washington had really lost his taste for the military life. That's an important thing to remember. I talked about how Washington changed. A lot of the interpretations of Washington claim that ambition was the driving force for his life throughout his life, that never changed. He always wanted to be the top guy. He always wanted military glory. But his attitude toward war and his attitude toward the military profession changed. Again, he was not broken, but he viewed things more realistically than he had before. And he no longer saw, by the 1760s, 1770s, the military life as an area of personal ambition. I contradict what a lot of people think here, but I think that's important to know as we look at why he became commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. Now, in the 1760s, Washington, again, seeing his deficiencies, seeing his flaws, he embarks on a campaign of self-education. He reads endlessly. He reads military theory in case he needs to apply it later on, but he just tries to educate himself in general. He improves his penmanship, he improves his writing, his grammar, his math, everything else, again, seeing where he lacked in the past, and becomes better. But by the time the Revolutionary War began, Washington's attitude was not the same that it had been 20 years before. I want to focus on a couple of things in the Revolutionary War. One, why did he become commander-in-chief? Why did he accept the office of commander-in-chief of the Continental Army? If you want to understand Washington's character, if you want to understand what made him great, it's important that we don't misinterpret and misunderstand what was going on in June of 1775, when Washington appears as a delegate at the Second Continental Congress. You will frequently hear the story of Washington appearing in Congress wearing his military uniform. And the interpretation of that's usually given is that when all of these events were developing and the war was beginning to become an inevitability, that Washington was saying, look at me, I'm your guy. I can lead this army and I can win. That was not the case at all. Now, this is possibly rather subtle. I'll proceed with care here in trying to explain what his thinking was. I mentioned how Washington had a great sense of true humility and true assessment of himself. Washington looked at himself, and he looked at this crisis, and he looked at this war, and he thought in very idealistic terms. Here again, I contradict what many people say about Washington. A lot of people will say that he was pragmatic, that he was a hard-headed realist, even that he was cynical. Washington was an idealist, fundamentally. He viewed things in terms of right and wrong. Honor, duty, sacrifice meant something to him. Liberty meant something to him. He truly believed in the cause, and you cannot understand why he did what he did if you don't understand that he believed in this cause. He believed it was worth sacrificing for. That was fundamental to his thinking. First, it's worth the sacrifice. It's important. Now, George Washington, look at yourself. Who are you? How can you serve? How can you sacrifice? How can you give yourself to this cause that's worth fighting for? Well, let's face facts. I'm George Washington, not a great public speaker, not really a politician. Mount Vernon is not going to just supply food to the troops. That's not going to be where I'm most effective. Look, I have experience, I have knowledge as a soldier. Here is where I can serve this cause most effectively as a soldier. Therefore, I wear my uniform to Congress and I say, here's how I can serve. In any military capacity you may choose. His attitude was not, I want to be the top guy. His attitude was, I am a soldier. I am at the service of my country. Use that service wherever you think fit. And his attitude toward the war and toward the challenge and the struggle ahead of them was not, we're going to beat these guys, we're going to win. But his attitude was, this is going to be tough, it's going to be challenging, it's going to be a long struggle, and we may lose. When he accepts the commission as commander-in-chief, he has serious doubts about whether this is a winning proposition or not. Great Britain is a powerful empire. Their riches, their economic wealth is practically boundless. They have a very efficient and strong army. They have the greatest navy in the world. We're presuming to build an army, build a military force, and take them on and win. That's not easy. And Washington, having experienced quite a bit of warfare in his own time, understood there's going to be a lot of pain, there's going to be a lot of suffering, it's worth the effort. But we may lose. For Washington, that meant knowledge that if we may lose, if I'm in command, I may well go down as a great failure, as a disaster, as the man who lost the war. He really believed there was a good chance. That doesn't mean he was defeatist, but that was a realistic assessment of what the possibilities were, of what might happen. But he was willing to take the risk because he believed in the cause. That is absolutely fundamental to understanding Washington's attitude. Now, to talk briefly about how Washington viewed the war, once he had taken this commission, once he had accepted command of the army, there's a perception of Washington as a military commander that in some ways dates from Vietnam, and historians writing in the Vietnam era tended to view the Revolutionary War as an insurgency war, and Washington as the insurgent commander. And it's from this period that date a lot of interpretations of Washington as the guerrilla in chief, or as the Fabian warrior, after the classical general Fabius, who supposedly had this attitude that I'm going to preserve my army and outlast the enemy and avoid putting it in a place where it may be destroyed. That's how we've typically understood Washington's command in the Revolutionary War. That he preserved his army, he preserved it from defeat, that he outlasted the British in an insurgency campaign, and eventually they quit. A lot like how we tended to interpret Vietnam, and those parallels were drawn. I think that's about as far from the truth as you can actually get. When Washington looked at the challenge ahead of him at the beginning of the Revolutionary War, and he saw, how are we going to fight this war? His view was, if we think we're going to outlast the British Empire, we're fools. We haven't a chance. What we need to do is we need to win one or a series of sharp victories, or force on the British Pyrrhic victories like Bunker Hill, where, they get Breed's Hill, they get Charlestown Peninsula, but they suffer appalling casualties. Washington said, we need more of those. And to convince the British as quickly as possible to quit. The longer the war goes on, the less likely we are to win. That was Washington's attitude. And that attitude continues throughout the war. Even after the early campaigns of 1775, forcing the British out of Boston in 76, the campaigns around New York and leading through New Jersey up to Trenton, and then in the Philadelphia campaign, where Washington was involved in 1777, Washington, yes, he's able to preserve his army, sometimes through sheer luck, but he's also looking very aggressively for the opportunity to inflict defeats on the enemy. That was what Trenton was about. Not that he thought that by crossing the Delaware he was going to cripple the British army. He understood this was a small affair, but the morale aspects of it were very important. But later on, Washington becomes completely preoccupied with attacking New York City and the British garrison in New York City once they've captured it. So he's looking for Yorktown long before it actually happens. Now let me zero in before I finish on a couple of things. What made Washington great as a commander in the Revolutionary War? I think the moment of Washington's military career, the moment, is Valley Forge. Was it a turning point in the war? Did it really change the military fortunes of the revolutionary forces? No, not really. Saratoga certainly was probably, in military terms, purely military terms, the turning point, because it brought France into the war. But in Washington's career, what showed him at his greatest, at his finest, as a military leader? And what transformed his relationship with his army that was to prove so important later on? Valley Forge. What did Washington show at Valley Forge that was so remarkable? Valley Forge in the winter of 1777 to 1778, very briefly, this winter campaign comes at the end of a long series of defeats through 1777. Washington's army has been beaten again and again and again. They've lost Philadelphia again. Tactically, as a tactician, Washington doesn't look very good. The British outsmart him. General William Howe was a better tactician than Washington was, and he showed it. By the end of 1777, Washington has suffered all of these defeats. Horatio Gates, actually Benedict Arnold and others up in Saratoga and around Saratoga have won a series of victories that have made Gates look a whole lot better than Washington does, and there are a number of people calling for Washington's head. Washington leads his army into this place, Valley Forge, that nobody's ever heard of. His troops are disgruntled, they're upset, and they show their discontent. They wanted to go into a town or a city where they could actually last out the winter in warmth and comfort. He says, no, we're going to Valley Forge. There are a lot of military reasons for that I don't have time to get into. says, we'll go to Valley Forge. At the very same moment they go to Valley Forge, this kind of jerry-rigged military administration that Congress had built at the beginning of the war falls to pieces. Corruption, incompetence, sheer bad luck, supply breaks down, the fundamentals break down. All of those things on which soldiers depend break down. They end up running out of food multiple times. Usually they subsist on moldy flour. Occasionally they'll get some rotten meat in. They're wearing their summer uniforms, which are in tatters. The weather is terrible. It's not too cold. In fact, Valley Forge is not cold enough. That was the big problem with it, is that there was too much precipitation and the temperatures hovered around 30, 32 degrees, a lot of sleet, freezing rain, stuff like that. Roads turn to mud, rivers get washed out, fords, ferries, bridges, very few bridges are all washed out, supplies can't get into camp. Hospitals, disease goes through the army, a lot more I could talk about. The worst thing that happens at Valley Forge, though, is officers give up. Junior to senior officers, lieutenant to brigadier general, say, I've had enough. Now, running the Washington papers, when I get into that period of Valley Forge, there's, if you pardon the pun, there's a blizzard of letters of resignation that come into Washington, or letters demanding furlough, saying, General, I've given years of service, I can't take it anymore, my health is breaking down, my farm is failing, I need to go home on a furlough. If you don't give me a furlough, I resign. So those officers on whom the Army depends for everything leave. Many of them do. Imagine what that's like for the enlisted men. You're suffering, you're going through an ordeal, your officers quit. Now, isn't that going to make you want to go home too? Isn't that going to make you want to give up and leave? Here's where Washington proves the Lynch Pin, because he understands fundamentals, because he understands how do you get those fundamentals in place. Work, self-discipline, work, dedication. It's not about going and giving speeches. It's not about riding the white horse through camp and parading about and showing how glorious you are. It's not about waving your sword. It's about working and letting the men see that you're in your headquarters day and night, working on those fundamentals to see that they get to the Army, so that they know that Washington is leaving no stone unturned to see that they get fed, that they get clothed, that they get shelter, that they get sanitation. I could go on and on about it and what he does. And those who stay with him, Nathaniel Greene, Henry Knox, Lafayette, Steuben, and the discipline that he brings to the Army. But what this does is it completely transforms the relationship between Washington and his army. When that army marches out of Valley Forge in the late spring of 1778, it doesn't crawl out, it marches out stronger than it had ever been before when the British evacuate Philadelphia. And it marches out with a completely different relationship between Washington and his men, his officers, and his enlisted troops than it had ever been there before. Before, the men followed him often, not always. Before, they respected him, usually. After Valley Forge, they love him, they trust him, they believe in him, because he knows that, or he shows that he cares whether they live or die. And when the soldiers believe that their commander cares on an individual basis for each of them, whether they live or die, they're willing to make almost any sacrifice. They go to fight at Monmouth Courthouse in June, an incredible heat, 1778, which was a draw, essentially, but for the first time really in that battle, Continentals met Redcoats toe-to-toe and fought them to a standstill. At the beginning of that battle, the troops, there was some confusion. Washington was not on the field. Charles Lee mishandles the troops. They begin withdrawing. Washington appears on the battlefield. This is the first time it happened in the war. His simple appearance on the battlefield without having said a word changes everything. The troops are withdrawing. They're not in a rout, but they're withdrawing. They're ready to leave. It's another defeat. Washington is here. Everything's all right. They stop their retreat. And the cheering begins. And eyewitnesses to this, of what happened, say it was like a jolt of electricity that went through the force when Washington appeared on the scene. That relationship had completely transformed because of Valley Forge, because of that attitude toward fundamentals. Now, I'll fast forward ahead and I'll conclude with one point. What were the long-term repercussions of this, of what had happened with the Army and what had happened in the transformed relationship with Washington and his men and his officers? Yes, many more battles were to come. Yes, there would be many more trials. Yorktown was a great victory, and again, this was an example of Washington looking for that decisive military victory that would end the war, and it was his decisiveness and his willingness to leap for it when the opportunity offered that made it possible. But after Yorktown, there were times when everything still looked like it was going to fall apart, particularly in what Washington had always worried about, the economic area, the economic sphere. It gets to a point in 1783 where if you want to buy a horse, you have to pay $150,000 because the currency had depreciated so much. But particularly, a gap had grown in American society, a gap between those who served and those who did not, between soldiers, between civilians. It's happened again and again and again in every war that we've ever fought. And it happened here, in many ways, for the first time. Those who served felt that their sacrifices were not appreciated, that their sacrifices were not respected, and that they faced the prospect of returning home to broken families, broken farms, broken businesses, and having to make do with no type of support, with no type of prospect for the future. Many of those who stayed at home had developed an increased suspicion of what the military was going to do. It reached the point in March of 1783, the gap had grown so wide that there was very serious consideration within the Army of marching on Congress and enforcing some type of post-war system of pensions and support that Congress seemed unable or unwilling to do. There were those who wrote and said, Congress does not care. The American people do not care about you, officers and men of the Continental Army. They do not care. They've given up on you. We need to march on Congress. Who's the one man who can walk into that gap and reach out with both hands and, if not close the gap, at least prevent it from fracturing the country hopelessly? That's George Washington. That's where he becomes the indispensable man, and he's been able to do that by virtue of very basic things, very basic attention to fundamentals, hard work, discipline, duty. He reaches in, he gives his talk to the officers. There's that famous moment where he puts on his glasses before them and he says, "Gentlemen, I have grown gray in your service. I now also find myself growing blind." He very deliberately does not, again, wave the sword and talk about great battles and glory and things like that, but he says, "Look, I've given everything for you. I've sacrificed alongside you. I've taken the same risks you have," as he did physically and personally. Trust me. Trust me. Nobody else could have done that. And in a very fundamental way, we owe the survival of the Republic and our victory in the Revolutionary War to George Washington. Thank you very much. think we have some time for questions. Yes.
Hi. One of the societies that started soon after the Society of Cincinnatus and the story of Cincinnatus, I've always kind of wondered, why did the society pick Cincinnatus as the model? Because, George Washington, I see him, the story of Cincinnatus. I think he knew the story, liked the story, tried to uphold those ideals. But why did the people who wanted to crown him king and become the nobility of America decide to call their society after something that was sort of the antithesis of it?
Sure. Let me say, first of all, that one of the other stories of Washington and the American Revolution that I think is really mythical is the story that Washington could have been king. Now, admittedly, there were some people who talked about that. There were really a relatively few people who talked about founding a dynasty and making Washington king. But this is one of kind of the legends that's grown up around the early part of the Republic, that somehow Washington had this moment of moral crisis, that there was a vast secret army of royalists who were waiting in the woods, and many people assumed that the Cincinnatian society was behind this and that they were like his secret army, and that they were waiting there, and that all Washington had to do was raise his hand and say, "I am King George I," and thousands of royalists would have come out and taken over, and there would have been a great dynasty, and that it was all because of Washington's decision not to do that we have a republic today. That's really not true. First of all, because there never really was any basis of support for royal government. And second, because Washington never even considered it. I mean, nobody around Washington in military command ever considered it. Yes, the possibility of military dictatorship in some form was there, although Washington didn't consider that either. But Washington never even thought about it. And there was somebody named Louis Nicola, who was a colonel of the Invalid Regiment, who dared to hint to Washington, well, maybe America might need a royal government somewhere down the road. And Washington was so horrified and shocked, he slapped Nicola down figuratively and said, "Don't you ever bring that up again." And Nicola was like horrified and destroyed. So the Society of the Cincinnati and the idea of the Cincinnatus, that Washington is the American Cincinnatus who wins a great victory and then returns home to his plow, that was a conscious role, very conscious role. Washington looked at himself as a public figure, and he saw that he was playing a public role, that he was in many ways going through an act, a predetermined act, that ahead of time this was scripted for him. He's going to resign from the army, he's going to tender his submission to Congress, and he's going to go home to his farm. That was already scripted before it happened. He accepted it, Congress accepted it. That was the reason when you'll see some presentations of what happened when Washington tendered his resignation, that somehow everybody in Congress got up and applauded and said, "Yay, thank you, thank you." No, it was silent. When he tendered his resignation to Congress, they sat there and then stood in respect silently. Nobody said thank you, because that was his duty. That was what he was supposed to do. So in taking kind of that Society of the Cincinnati, and again, that title, that was a very conscious decision to show, despite what some people are saying, you form this hereditary organization of officers who served, there's the danger that it could become like Oliver Cromwell in a situation like that. No, we're showing that we invest in that script and that role of the Cincinnatus, and we believe in the Republic. Where was he? Yeah.
I just yell at the kids. But I appreciate the information you gave us about Valley Forge. I hadn't thought about it that much as a real turning point and one of the key turning points. And so my question relates, I always have viewed Trenton really as Washington's greatest moment, because we had the Declaration of Independence in July of 1776, and essentially by December we'd pretty much lost the war. And everybody thought we lost the war except Washington and those who followed him. But I wonder about your assessment of the impact of that. Was that in any way similar to, I would think that would have raised Washington in the eyes of his soldiers and the trust, and I think to a certain extent it did, but apparently not as much as Valley Forge. So
right.
If you could give me your assessment of the comparison of those two.
Sure. There are a couple of things I would say about Trenton, and I would merge Princeton into that, the Trenton-Princeton campaign. Just on purely tactical or operational terms, that was probably Washington's most brilliant campaign. And I would say not just, again, the crossing of the Delaware and Trenton, but if you look at the Princeton campaign afterwards and what Washington was able to accomplish there, it was like he got into his zone. And he truly became a great tactician, a great general at that moment, again, purely in battlefield terms. And eventually that ends in forcing the British having to give up most of their gains in New Jersey from the whole previous year. So it's very important in those terms. It started out as a pinprick raid, but it became actually fairly important. But one of the most important things I think about Trenton and looking at Washington as a commander is that Washington believed in the autumn and early winter of 76 that the country had reached a moral crisis. And this happens again at other points in the war. Washington worries incessantly about, are the American people still invested in the struggle and still invested in the cause? And when it reaches the point where he thinks people are losing hope, losing faith, corruption is becoming rampant, people are negotiating with the British, Washington practically and literally starts tearing his hair out and getting very upset, very angry, very distressed, very emotional. But then it's like he brings himself together and he says, George, you've just got to do something about this. Complaining doesn't do any good. We've got to bring the American people back together and focused on the cause again. The Trenton campaign was very deliberately a moral cause, a moral crusade, and an attempt to refocus Americans on the cause. That it was an attempt to achieve some type of public victory to show that we haven't lost yet. He didn't view it as just, okay, we'll do this and we'll maneuver the British out of New Jersey, et cetera, et cetera. He said we've got to do this in order to renew Americans' hope that we can win this thing. And that's what he sets out to do. So, in that sense, and in terms of Washington's relationship with his army, yes, it does increase their trust in him, but there's still multiple times in 77 afterwards where his troops will break and run and just won't listen to him. So, yes, it improves things, but I think Valley Forge really changed things around. Yes, Henry.
Hi. By the time then that Washington finally resigned, what would you say then were the weaknesses that Washington never did learn about, or maybe did improve upon himself? That's
a really good question of what were his weaknesses, what did he not improve upon? I would say he still had some aspects of the military art, especially tactically, that he didn't handle quite well. He had, in particular, a tendency to overestimate what his forces could achieve in any situation. I think that was partly because of his idealism, partly because he would imagine in his mind when he was facing any type of a battle or a campaign, that if everybody will just give their best, if everybody will simply focus on this and make the sacrifice, we'll win a great victory. And he still comes up with some schemes sometimes. Right before he ended up going to Yorktown, he still would have, with pleasure, launched an all-out assault on the British entrenchments at New York City, because he really believed there was a chance, if everybody gave their best, we could still defeat the British and recapture New York City. Almost certainly that would have been a disaster. And the French, Rochambeau is there, and Rochambeau keeps trying to kind of talk him out of it and say, this really isn't as easy as you think it is. But Washington just keeps imagining that if we just all give our best, we can do it. So there's a certain lack of, if I even dare say it, a lack of realistic thinking from time to time in Washington, and a tendency to overestimate what he could do. So I'd say in those areas really is where he continues to fall short.
Hi, I'm Michael Weber from Festus High School in Missouri. I was wondering if you could comment a little bit on the alliance with the French. Did that have any kind of an impact on the way that Washington envisioned his army or his relationship with his men?
Sure. Good question also. When people talk about Washington's relationship with the French, usually the first thing they'll talk about is Washington and Lafayette. And again, the story is that that was very much a father-son relationship, that Washington, when he met Lafayette and he saw how dashing and wonderful he was as a young man, Washington thought of him as the son he never had, and that it became a very close friendship. There are aspects of that that are true, but the reason I bring that up is that there was an element of calculation in how Washington built his relationship with Lafayette that he understood from the very beginning. And one of my colleagues at the Washington papers wrote a very good article on this, that Washington understood, I've got to become friends with this guy, and it's got to become a very public friendship, because this could become the basis and the foundation for the whole relationship between the United States and France. That building that relationship with Lafayette will show in a very public way how we can cooperate. Now, deep down, Washington is still quite suspicious of France. There's a great letter that Washington wrote in 1779 where there were people who were trying to convince him that we need to cooperate with France in an invasion of Canada. And Congress is pushing this, Horatio Gates is pushing this. But what Washington says, he writes a public letter to Congress and saying there are all these logistical reasons we can't do it. But then he writes a private letter to the President of Congress saying the real reason I don't want this to happen is because if the French regain Canada, they'll have it in their power to give law to these states. That's the exact phrase he uses. So he's still very suspicious of French ambitions, but he understands practically once France joins the war, once Rochambeau comes over, and also Admiral d'Estaing, even before Rochambeau, that I need to maintain a very, very strong relationship with the French, no matter what happens. In the Rhode Island, siege of Rhode Island in 1779, where there's an attempt on a joint Franco-American attack, and the French fleet ends up sailing off and leaving Americans in the lurch, Americans are ready to just break the alliance right there. Generals are yelling and complaining. Lafayette thinks he's going to be lynched, literally. He says, I feel more danger, personal danger in the streets of Boston than I ever felt in battle. Washington heals that breach, and he refuses to give in to emotions about it. So him and Rochambeau, really, because Rochambeau does many of the same things on his side, their personal dedication and commitment to maintaining that alliance despite their mutual suspicions is really fundamental to the victory in the war as well.
Time for one last question.
Hi, I have the good fortune of living... What? Oh, P.J. Shigan from the American Academy, and I have the good fortune of living within 10 minutes of Valley Forge, so that's a place that we always try to go. But I'm really I very much enjoyed your talk, and one of the reasons is because even in the course of going to Valley Forge, and certainly in looking at the curriculum, the kinds of things that are emphasized about Valley Forge seldom show the scope and the depth that you have. You get much more of von Steuben and his importance, Washington's willingness to live under his marquee in a tent until the huts go up, and even Martha Washington's visits that were able to allow him to entertain members of Congress that he kept bringing out and officers. But you really don't get the sense of his persona and that sort of thing. Do you have an explanation of why you think that's true?
Of why that we've overlooked,
yes.
Washington's
and why it's really
persona.
not available. I haven't found in texts either, even at a higher level.
Now, I will say that Valley Forge has long been, in histories of the Revolutionary War, in histories of Washington, and in biographies of Washington, that's always been focused on as kind of a great moment. But it's become, and that goes all the way back. If you look at books written in the 1800s, they're always talking about Valley Forge, but I think it's been repeated so often it's become a cliche. And it's been viewed as, if I can say so, as something that's so miraculous, the survival at Valley Forge. And it's often referred to as a miracle, the miracle at Valley Forge, that we've maybe lost sight of the hard work that went into making this happen and allowing the Army to get through the crisis. There are all types of legends and stories that have grown up about Valley Forge, which you're probably familiar with, that Washington saw an angel at Valley Forge, who told him about the future of the United States and all of these things that all have tended to reinforce this vision of it as something that transcends human agency. Whatever your feelings about that may be, what eventually fundamentally got the Army through, either way, whether you view it as a miracle or not, you can't get past what he did, and Martha and Katie Green and Lucy Knox and the women who were there and the other officers who were there as well, that I think maybe people see that as being too blasé. That, oh, well, hard work. What's glorious about hard work? What's glorious about simple day-to-day, night-to-night dedication? What we want is a great story of some blazing, shining moment. And I think we've tended to overlook that. So.
The closest they actually come to the nitty-gritty of Valley Forge, I think, is restaging the march-in. And there have actually been evenings when I've gone and it's been just awfully cold and snow has come down, and you finally begin to get in your head, wow, this must have been quite a really terrible thing. But that's the closest, I think.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.